He was called the Angel of Death at Auschwitz, a physician who presided over selections and ordered experiments that left deep scars on survivors and on history. Then, in the chaos of 1945, Josef Mengele disappeared. What happened to him after the war is not merely the biography of a fugitive. It is the story of how post-war disorder, clandestine networks, and shifting political priorities allowed some architects of mass violence to slip from legal reach. This narrative follows the path by which Mengele fled Europe, how he lived in exile, and how his life finally ended. Not with a trial, but with a forensic verdict decades later. In the winter of 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. Allied armies advanced from east and west, concentration camps were evacuated or liberated, and the scale of Nazi crimes became visible to the world. Auschwitz-Birkenau, where Mengele's name would become synonymous with cruelty, was abandoned in the face of the Soviet advance in late January. Amid the chaos of collapsing communications, overwhelmed military detachments, and tens of thousands of displaced persons, the machinery that might have arrested many perpetrators simply did not function uniformly. Some high-ranking figures were captured and prosecuted. Others vanished into the ruins of Europe. Josef Mengele was among those who slipped away from immediate accountability. Source: archival records, survivor testimonies, historian consensus. But the confusion of 1945 alone does not explain how a wanted man avoided justice for decades. The immediate post-war years produced several overlapping conditions that created openings. Allied forces prioritized military objectives, the processing of millions of prisoners and refugees, and the reconstruction of shattered institutions. Denazification was uneven, bureaucracies were strained, and intelligence services were limited and fragmented. Meanwhile, a number of clandestine networks emerged, what historians have come to call rat lines, through which former Nazis and collaborators found assistance in escaping Europe. These networks were neither monolithic nor conspiratorial in the sensational sense. They included a range of actors, sympathizers in clerical and political circles, opportunistic brokers, and organized groups that exploited gaps in refugee systems. The precise mechanisms and degrees of institutional complicity remain subjects of ongoing research, with specific claims supported by differing strengths of evidence. Source: scholarly studies on rat lines, investigative journalism, verify source for specific claims. Conceptually, the rat lines worked by routing fugitives from Central Europe to ports and border crossings where ships or visas could be obtained for the Americas. Italy and Portugal figure prominently in most reconstructions as transit points. Bishops, priests, and some émigré networks offered travel documents or shelter in monasteries and convents. Forged or misused Red Cross documents and sympathetic officials sometimes smoothed passage to countries willing to accept European migrants. Argentina, in particular, became a magnet for many former Nazis and their collaborators. Under Juan Perón, Argentina pursued immigration policies that favored European settlement, and communities of European émigrés provided social cover for newcomers whose pasts were often unexamined. Yet scholars caution that the picture is messy. Not every emigrant was aided by formal rat lines, and the roles of specific clergy or officials are contested and require careful sourcing. Source: Immigration Archives, historians on Perón-era Argentina, verify source for specific actors. Mengele's own movements after 1945 exemplify these patterns without fitting neatly into a single open and shut account. At the end of January 1945, as Auschwitz was evacuated, Mengele left the camp area. In the immediate months thereafter, he moved within the collapsing German state, taking advantage of the confusion to avoid detection. For a period, he managed to live and work under an assumed identity in Germany, and later he found his way to South America. Researchers have pieced together evidence that by the late 1940s, Mengele had reached Argentina, joining a diaspora of European émigrés and other former Nazis who had established communities there. The precise details of his initial travel, the exact routes, dates, and the identities of those who assisted him, are the subject of archival investigation and are reported with varying degrees of certainty in the literature. Where sources conflict, those discrepancies should be noted. Source: investigative reports, immigration documents, indefinido on some specifics. Argentina became a long-term refuge for Mengele. There he sought anonymity among other German-speaking migrants, sometimes working casual jobs, sometimes living under assumed names, sometimes moving between provincial towns and more populated areas. He cultivated a low profile, avoiding public notoriety in ways that would later frustrate those hunting him. His social world in exile included other former Nazis and collaborators, some of whom remained politically active in émigré circles, others blended into civilian life. For many fugitives, survival required a mixture of practical adaptation, finding income, housing, and local connections, and the psychological labor of hiding in plain sight. Reports indicate that Mengele, like some of his counterparts, made use of sympathizers and existing émigré networks to sustain himself. Yet the full extent of official or clerical assistance, if any, varies between sources and in some places remains disputed. Source: Argentine documents, testimonies, historian analyses. Verify source for specific connections. The story of Mengele's exile is also a story of missed opportunities and the limits of post-war justice. International attention to Nazi fugitives grew over time, particularly as investigators, journalists, and dedicated Nazi hunters began to compile leads and pursue them across borders. Simon Wiesenthal and other pursuit networks made exposures that pushed governments to act in some cases. The capture of Adolf Eichmann in 1960 by Israeli agents in Buenos Aires stands as the contrasting case. Eichmann was found, abducted, tried in Israel, and executed, a juridical reckoning that drew worldwide attention and catalyzed a sense that justice could still be done, even years after the crimes. Eichmann's capture owed much to his distinct role in the Nazi bureaucracy and to the intelligence efforts that tracked him down. Mengele, by contrast, proved harder to pin to a single traceable trail. He moved more frequently, maintained a lower public profile, and benefited from the affordances of rural life and small communities where scrutiny was less intense. That combination helped explain how Eichmann ended in a courtroom while Mengele remained at large. Source: Mossad Archives, Eichmann trial records, comparative historical accounts. As the 1960s and 1970s unfolded, pressure grew. Journalists and investigators periodically published tips and leads alleging sightings of Mengele across South America. Governments at times exchanged information with foreign counterparts. Police inquiries produced intermittent searches. But these efforts were hampered by practical and political constraints. Incomplete records, the reluctance of some local authorities to pursue delicate foreign cases, the legal difficulties of extradition, and a lack of coordinated international mechanisms for tracking war criminals until later decades. Moreover, Mengele adapted to these pressures by moving, changing residences, and cultivating a network of supporters, or at least neighbors who did not wish to draw attention. The result was decades of reported sightings, frustrated investigators, and mounting frustration among survivors who yearned for a public trial that would place a figure so closely associated with Auschwitz under judicial scrutiny. Source: International police correspondence, investigative reporting, survivor advocacy groups. In 1979, the arc of Mengele's life ended, not in a courtroom, but in a sudden, private death. While swimming off the coast of Brazil near the town of Bertioga, he suffered a stroke, or heart attack, some accounts specify stroke, and drowned. He was buried locally under an assumed name. The death itself removed the possibility of a public trial, and for many that absence of legal closure felt like an injustice. Yet the investigatory story did not end there. Years later, prompted by continuing inquiries and advances in forensic science, authorities exhumed the remains attributed to the man buried under the alias. Forensic anthropologists examined skeletal remains and compared anatomical and dental records. Subsequently, in the early 1990s, DNA testing was employed to determine whether the remains matched relatives of Josef Mengele. The scientific evidence converged toward confirming that the man who had died in Brazil in 1979 was, in fact, Josef Mengele. Those forensic conclusions closed the factual loop in a way that legal systems never did. The body that had buried a fugitive was identified, and the historical record could finally attribute that death to the notorious Auschwitz physician. Source: Forensic reports, exhumation records, DNA analysis reports. Verify source dates and labs. It's important to state the limits of what a forensic identification accomplishes. A DNA match establishes identity in a biological sense, but it cannot substitute for the public adjudication of guilt that a trial would have provided. The evidentiary process, witness testimony, and a formal verdict in a court of law. For survivors and for communities seeking symbolic redress, trials have a particular moral and historical function. They place crimes in the public record under the scrutiny of law. Mengele's death before arrest meant he never faced that process. The absence of trial leaves unresolved questions about accountability in a legal, ritual, and communal sense, even where documentary evidence and survivor testimony have long established the nature of the crimes he committed. Source: Legal Scholarship on Trials and Transitional Justice. The broader lessons of this story reach beyond one man. Mengele's post-war flight and eventual death highlight structural weaknesses that shaped the post-war world. How overwhelmed institutions, competing political priorities, and incomplete international cooperation enabled some perpetrators to evade justice. They also show how memory and history interact with law. Over the decades, historians, journalists, and investigators filled gaps through archival research, interviews, and forensic science, producing a layered account that combines testimony, documentation, and biology. That layered account has moral force even when legal closure is absent. It ensures that the historical record acknowledges the crimes and the suffering of victims and keeps the facts available for future generations. Source: Historiography, Survivor Memorials. There is also a cautionary political angle. The same patterns that allowed escape, porous borders, sympathetic networks, and the politicization of post-war migration policy repeatedly appear in different contexts where states fail to confront past crimes. Accountability requires institutional will, international collaboration, and archives that remain accessible to scholars and investigators. Where those conditions are weak, perpetrators can exploit the gaps. The example of Eichmann shows that capture was possible when political will, intelligence capacity, and public attention converged. The contrast with Mengele's fate shows the opposite. When those elements are absent or inconsistent, even notorious figures can avoid the courtroom. Source: Comparative Studies, International Law Analyses. At the human level, the absence of a trial for Mengele mattered deeply to survivors. For many who endured Auschwitz, the wish to see perpetrators confronted in public was about more than punishment. It was about testimony, memory, and the affirmation of truth. Trials offer a space where historical facts are formally acknowledged, where witnesses are heard, and where societies can register moral condemnation through legal mechanisms. The years that passed between the crimes at Auschwitz and their final documentary and forensic closure turned that need for public reckoning into a prolonged grief for some survivors. A grief complicated by the knowledge that legal justice would never be realized in the defendant's lifetime. Source: Survivor Testimonies, Oral Histories. How should history remember Josef Mengele? The answer must balance two imperatives. First, the record must be clear about his role. He was a physician who participated in selections and human experimentation at Auschwitz, facts documented by survivor accounts and archival material. Second, the post-war story of his flight and life in exile should be told in a manner that resists sensationalism and avoids either undue personalization or inadvertent mitigation. Mengele's ability to disappear into the mid-20th century world of migration and exile is a cautionary tale about the limits of mechanisms meant to ensure accountability after mass atrocity. It is also a testament to the persistence of investigative labor. Archivists, journalists, lawyers, forensic scientists, and survivors all contributed pieces that, over decades, constructed a coherent historical account, even without a court verdict. Source: Archival Consensus, Scholarly Syntheses. For the audience watching this investigation, the case of Josef Mengele raises enduring questions. How do societies ensure that those responsible for mass crimes are identified and held to account? What are the ethical and practical limits of post-conflict justice? And how can historical memory be preserved so that future generations understand both the crimes and the obstacles to accountability? These are not theoretical problems. They have real consequences for victims and for the polity's commitment to the rule of law. If this examination resonates with you, and you'd like deeper dives into related cases, how other Nazi fugitives were pursued, how rat lines operated in practice, or how forensic science has helped resolve cold cases of mass atrocity, subscribe and check the description for sources and a curated reading list. CTA. When the last facts of Mengele's life were assembled, they did not deliver the courtroom drama that many desired. Instead, they produced a different form of closure: forensic confirmation of identity, careful reconstruction of movements, and a public record that ties a name to acts and a death to a story. That kind of closure matters. It preserves the truth against denial and forgetfulness. Yet it also leaves a hollow in the moral geography of justice, the place where a trial might have been. Remembering how and why that hollow occurred is part of the obligation history places upon us. In the end, the story of Josef Mengele after 1945 is both specific and emblematic. It is the specific account of a man who walked out of the ruins of a genocidal regime and became a private presence in foreign lands. It is also emblematic of a broader phenomenon: the post-war world's uneven capacity to transform moral outrage into legal resolution. That mismatch between culpability and courtroom should inform how we design institutions today: stronger international cooperation, better preservation of archives, more robust investigative resources, and a public memory that does not allow the past to slip unnoticed into the present. Mengele died in hiding. His remains were later identified by science. The legal question of his guilt was never adjudicated in open court, but the historical and moral verdict is unambiguous. The archives, survivor testimonies, and the weight of evidence confirm the nature of his crimes. We remember him, not to sensationalize, but to insist that the facts remain visible, that victims are not forgotten, and that future societies learn the hard lesson that justice delayed can sometimes be justice denied. For more investigations into how the world chased, and sometimes failed to catch, perpetrators of genocide, subscribe and follow the linked sources and reading list in the description. Final CTA.